Good evening and welcome to Quiet Victorian Nights. Tonight, we travel to the quiet English village of Hollow Ash, where the orchards are heavy with late summer fruit and a woman carrying an old recipe book is about to discover that knowledge, when freely shared, can become a kind of home. Settle comfortably, let the day grow still around you, and allow Cordelia Vane's gentle story to begin. In March of 1897, when the mornings at Ashcombe Park were still silvered with frost, and the first pale leaves had only just begun to appear upon the gooseberry bushes, Cordelia Vane entered the preserving room shortly after 6 o'clock and found it waiting in its usual order. The room occupied the northern end of the service wing, where the thick stone walls kept out the warmth even during the height of summer. Its two high windows faced a narrow courtyard and admitted a cool, even light over the scrubbed tables, the copper pans, and the deep shelves upon which the remaining preserves of the previous year stood in quiet rows. There were jars of strawberry and blackcurrant, spiced pears, cherries in syrup, and dark damson cheese wrapped in waxed paper. Each bore a small label written in Cordelia's narrow, upright hand, recording not only the fruit and the date, but, when necessary, the weather in which it had been gathered. Nothing in the room had been placed without thought. Empty jars stood nearest the stone sink. Clean muslin cloths were folded beside the scales. Sugar was kept in the driest cupboard, away from the outer wall, and the wooden spoons hung above the stove according to size. The largest copper pan rested upon its own shelf, its base polished but darkened by 20 seasons of use. Cordelia had given 20 years to the order of that room. When she first arrived at Ashcombe Park, preserving had been treated as a summer duty remembered only when the fruit began to soften. Strawberries were sometimes left too long in their baskets. Jars were washed after the pans had already been set upon the stove, and sugar was measured with whatever cup happened to be near. A successful batch might be followed by one that fermented before Christmas, yet no record was kept of the difference between them. Cordelia had altered the work gradually. She weighed every basket before it entered the room. She recorded which varieties of plum held their flavor, which pears remained firm in syrup, and which apples softened best when cooked slowly. She noted when fruit had been gathered after rain and when a dry summer required more careful heating. If a jar spoiled, she did not merely throw it away. She examined the seal, the color, and the scent, then wrote down what she believed had gone wrong. Over the years, uncertainty became method. The preserves supplied the household through winter and filled Christmas hampers sent to relatives, tenants, and former servants. Visitors sometimes wrote to ask whether another jar of Ashcombe damson preserve might be included in the next parcel from the country. Cordelia accepted such praise without ceremony. A jar kept well because each small part of its preparation had been properly done. There was little mystery in the result, once the washing, weighing, watching, and waiting had been understood. That morning, there was no fruit upon the central table. March belonged to preparation rather than abundance. The rhubarb would come first, followed by gooseberries, strawberries, cherries, and currants, and then the heavier harvests of late summer. Cordelia had begun counting the empty jars and examining the pans for loose handles when unfamiliar footsteps crossed the courtyard. The door opened to admit the late owner's nephew, and a man in a dark business coat. The master of Ashcombe Park had died 3 months earlier after a brief illness. Since then, the house had continued through habit. Fires were lit, meals carried upstairs, and linen aired in the usual rooms, but men from Birmingham had begun appearing with notebooks and measuring tapes. They inspected the orchards, outbuildings, and kitchens, asking questions about quantities where earlier conversations had concerned seasons. Cordelia closed her inventory book and waited. The nephew explained that Ashcombe Park had been sold to a food company. The sale included the orchards, the service buildings, and the preserving facilities. Part of the estate would be converted for commercial production, and the preserving room would be enlarged to receive steam-heated vessels and mechanical sealing equipment. The man in the business coat described the new process with careful politeness. Fruit would be handled according to fixed quantities and standard heating times. Gauges would determine the temperature. Printed instructions would replace decisions made by observing color, scent, and consistency. A smaller number of attendants would be employed to operate the machinery. "Your experience is considerable, Miss Vane," he said, "but the new system will not require work of the kind you have been doing." Cordelia looked towards the shelves while he spoke. The jars stood exactly as they had a few minutes earlier. Above the stove hung a spoon whose handle had been worn smooth by her right hand. None of the work appeared less necessary because 2 men had entered the room and said that it was. She asked when the alterations would begin. Within a fortnight, they told her. The shelves would be removed first, and the wall adjoining the storeroom opened to make space for the larger equipment. Cordelia would receive her wages until the end of March, together with a payment acknowledging her 20 years of service. There was no accusation of failure. No spoiled batch had been discovered, and no error had been found in her ledgers. The room was changing because a different kind of work had become more profitable. It simply no longer needed her. After the men had gone, Cordelia reopened the inventory book. Her pencil remained beside an unfinished note concerning a loose handle on one of the smaller pans. She completed the sentence, added the date, and ruled a line beneath the morning's entries. For 20 years, every season had approached her with its own requirements. March asked for clean jars and sound equipment. June brought strawberries before the dew had dried from them. August filled the room with the heavy sweetness of plums, and even January required the shelves to be inspected against damp and broken seals. Now no season appeared to be waiting for her. During the following days, Cordelia packed only the things that belonged to her. The copper pans, scales, tables, and shelves remained the property of Ashcombe Park. She took a narrow fruit knife, 2 small wooden spoons, a muslin straining bag she had sewn herself, and the thermometer she used when testing an unfamiliar recipe. Last of all, she collected her private recipe book. It was not one of the estate ledgers. The book had belonged to her before she came to Ashcombe and contained recipes inherited from her mother, learned in earlier households, or developed through her own experiments. Its pages had thickened with use. Instructions had been corrected in the margins, and a faded purple stain crossed the page devoted to damson cheese. Cordelia wrapped the book in a clean cloth and placed it in her traveling case. On her final afternoon, she washed the long central table and returned the keys to the housekeeper. Chalk marks had already appeared upon the floor to indicate where the new machinery would stand. She walked once around the room, then closed the door without opening the ledgers again. The latch gave its familiar, quiet click, yet it did not feel like the end of a season. It felt as though the calendar had been taken from the wall while several months still remained upon it. Cordelia rented a modest furnished room in the nearby market town while she considered what work might remain open to a woman of 54 whose knowledge belonged to copper pans, orchard fruit, and patient observation. She had no husband or children, and no close relative lived near enough to offer more than a temporary room. In any case, Cordelia did not wish to become an obligation in another person's household. Each morning, she woke at the hour she had kept at Ashcombe. For several days, she dressed before remembering that no baskets would be delivered and no stove required lighting. After breakfast, she placed her recipe book upon the small table near the window and wrote letters to former housekeepers, merchants, and families who had once ordered preserves from the estate. She described her circumstances plainly. Ashcombe Park had been sold. Its preserving room was being converted for industrial production. She was seeking a position in which 20 years of practical experience might still be useful. The replies arrived gradually. One household had recently reduced its staff. Another had begun purchasing preserves from a manufacturer. A merchant in Cheltenham promised to keep her name, though he knew of no present vacancy. Every letter was courteous, none contained work. Near the end of March, a reply came from Mrs. Prue Hollis in Worcestershire. Cordelia had met Prue only twice. Years earlier, she had ordered several jars of Ashcombe plum preserve for a parish gathering, and further orders had followed for summer fetes and Christmas hampers. Her letters were warm and observant, often containing small details about village life that had little connection with the original order. Prue did not know of an empty position. She knew instead of a difficulty. The village in which she now lived was called Hollow Ash. It lay among orchards where Pershore and Victoria plums grew in abundance. In a good season, nearly every household gathered more fruit than it could use. Some was carried to market, some preserved in cottage kitchens, and much of what remained was sold hurriedly for very little or left beneath the trees once it became too ripe to transport. No individual family possessed enough jars, sugar, stove space, or labor to preserve the whole harvest. By the time one household had finished its own fruit, the plums in another orchard had already begun to split and fall. The same loss occurred every year. Prue believed the village might benefit from someone who understood preserving beyond the scale of an ordinary kitchen. She could promise neither wages nor a permanent position. Hollow Ash had no great house, no specialized workroom, and no wealthy employer prepared to take responsibility for the experiment. There were only scattered orchards, small kitchens, and a problem that would return when the plums ripened. If Cordelia wished to visit, however, Prue would arrange a room and introduce her to the growers. She might examine the kitchens and orchards for herself, then decide whether anything useful could be done. Cordelia read the letter twice. Hollow Ash offered no certainty. Methods suited to Ashcombe Park might prove impractical in cottages where sugar was bought by the pound and every pair of hands had other work. The growers might have neither the money nor the patience to follow the changes she suggested. There might be no proper place for her knowledge there, but the plums would still ripen. They would have to be gathered, sorted, and used before they softened. There would be pans to inspect, quantities to calculate, and jars that must be made clean enough to keep their contents through winter. For the first time since leaving Ashcombe, Cordelia found herself thinking beyond the following morning. She placed the wrapped recipe book in her open travelling case. Beside it, she packed the fruit knife, the thermometer, the muslin bag, and the 2 wooden spoons. Then she sat at the table, drew a sheet of writing paper towards her, and replied to Prue Hollis. She made no promise to solve the village's difficulty. She would first need to see the orchards, count the available stoves and jars, understand the size of the harvest, and learn how far the fruit must travel to reach a market. But she would come to Hollow Ash. She would look at the situation for herself. Less than 3 weeks after writing her reply to Prue Hollis, Cordelia Vane boarded a morning train bound for Worcestershire. It was the 3rd week of April 1897. The rain that had fallen during the night still lay upon the station roof, gathering along the edge of the glass before dropping at slow intervals onto the platform below. Porters moved between trunks and parcels beneath the pale steam, and somewhere beyond the waiting room, a metal door was repeatedly opened and closed. Cordelia stood beside her leather case until the train arrived, then allowed a porter to place it in the luggage compartment while she carried the smaller bag herself. The old recipe book travelled with her once more. It lay beneath a folded shawl, together with the fruit knife, the thermometer, the muslin bag, and the 2 wooden spoons she had taken from Ashcombe Park. They were not enough to furnish a preserving room, yet they were the few things upon which her hands might still rely. She found a seat beside the window. As the train drew away, the market town passed, in a succession of damp brick walls, narrow gardens, and washing lines that sagged beneath the rain. Soon the houses became scattered. The rails curved between open fields where the spring wheat had risen in faint green rows, and cattle stood near the hedges with their dark coats shining. Cordelia watched the country change without attempting to read. She had made many journeys on behalf of Ashcombe Park to purchase sugar, inspect jars, or speak with merchants, but on those occasions she had always known the room to which she would return. The copper pans had waited upon their shelves, the ledgers had remained in their cupboard, and the year had continued according to a sequence she understood. This journey had no such certainty at its end. Prue had promised her a room and introductions to the growers. Nothing more had been decided. There was no salary, no position, and no assurance that the people of Hollow Ash would consider her knowledge useful. Cordelia had agreed only to look at their circumstances and determine whether the loss of so much fruit might be prevented. By late morning, orchards began to appear beyond the railway embankment. Apples and pears stood in ordered rows upon the slopes, their branches carrying the last of the pale blossom. Between them were darker trees upon which the petals had already fallen. Small green plums, scarcely larger than buttons, had begun to form close to the branches. The fruit was too young to tell Cordelia what kind of season lay ahead. Frost, rain, or a succession of cold weeks might still reduce the harvest. Yet the number of trees was enough to explain Prue's letter. The orchards continued beyond one field and into the next, descending through the valley and rising again upon the further hills. Even a moderate crop would produce more fruit than a few cottage kitchens could easily preserve. At the small Worcestershire station, Prue Hollis was waiting beside a hired carriage. She greeted Cordelia with both hands and expressed her relief that the journey had been comfortable, though she seemed careful not to speak, as if Cordelia's arrival had already solved anything. Cordelia's case was secured behind the driver. The women sat together beneath a travelling rug, while the horse carried them away from the station and onto a narrow road bordered by damp hawthorn. Prue pointed out the villages and farms as they passed. The higher slopes held apples and pears, but near a hollow ash, the plum orchards became more numerous. Some belonged to families with enough land to employ several pickers during the harvest. Others consisted of only a dozen trees behind a cottage or along the edge of a field. Pershore plums grew in the heavier soil of the valley, while rows of Victoria trees occupied the warmer ground. The road descended slowly. Through the bare spaces beneath the branches, Cordelia could see ladders resting against shed walls, picking baskets stacked beneath sheets of canvas, and carts waiting beside gates. Everything required for the harvest appeared to be present in pieces, though nothing yet suggested how those pieces might be brought together. Hollow Ash stood near the bottom of the valley. Its cottages followed a shallow stream before gathering around a small church, a schoolroom, and the parish hall. Plum trees grew behind nearly every wall. Some had been planted in straight rows, while older trees leaned over gardens, hen runs, and wash houses, as though the village had been built around them. Prue had prepared a bedroom for Cordelia in the vicarage. It was a small room beneath the eastern roof, furnished with an iron bedstead, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a narrow table placed below the window. Beyond the glass lay the churchyard and, further away, an orchard rising towards the wooded edge of the valley. Cordelia unpacked the recipe book and placed it upon the table. She left the remainder of the case largely undisturbed. There would be time to arrange her clothes after she understood how long she might need them. The visits began the following morning. Prue first took her to a cottage where 8 plum trees grew behind a low stone wall. The kitchen contained a small black range, 1 deep iron pan, and 11 sound jars. 6 others had chipped rims or lids that no longer fitted closely. Sugar was kept in a blue paper packet upon the highest shelf, in a quantity sufficient for ordinary cooking, but not for several baskets of ripe fruit. At the next house, there were more jars and a wider stove, but only 1 pan suitable for preserving. Another family possessed 2 good pans, but lacked a dry cupboard in which sealed jars could be stored through winter. In one kitchen, the range burned unevenly. In another, the stove was large enough for several vessels, yet the woman who worked there also cared for 4 children and could not spend entire days watching fruit boil. Cordelia listened before she examined anything. She asked how much fruit each household had gathered the previous summer, how many baskets had been sold, and how much had been preserved. She wanted to know where sugar was purchased, how often jars were reused, and how the fruit was carried from the trees to the kitchen. The answers differed from house to house, but the difficulty remained the same. Each family could preserve a portion of its own harvest. One might make 12 jars of jam, another 20, and a larger household, perhaps twice that number. But when several trees ripened in the same warm week, the fruit arrived faster than any one kitchen could wash, cut, cook, and seal it. The plums left waiting in baskets softened at the bottom. Those kept too long upon the trees split or fell into the grass. Families took what they could to the local market, though the price declined whenever every grower arrived with the same fruit upon the same morning. Cordelia offered no solution during those first visits. She counted stove rings, measured pans, and examined the depth of shelves. She asked how many hours a family could spare during harvest and whether neighbors sometimes shared carts or labor. In her notebook, she recorded the number of usable jars beside each name and marked the households that could purchase sugar in larger quantities. The village received her politely, though not everyone welcomed the inspection. Cordelia had come from an estate whose preserving room contained more equipment than several hollow ash kitchens combined. Some women watched her hands as she lifted their pans, perhaps expecting her to find fault with the darkened bases or mismatched lids. She did not. A pan was useful if it heated evenly. A jar was useful if its rim remained sound. The work had to begin with what the village possessed, not with what Ashcombe Park had once been able to provide. Near the end of her first week, Prue took her to the western edge of Hollow Ash, where Walter Griggs owned the largest plum orchard in the valley. His trees covered several adjoining fields and descended towards a long packing shed beside the road. Beneath the young leaves, the new fruit appeared in such numbers that Cordelia stopped more than once to examine the branches. Walter met them outside the shed. He was courteous to Cordelia, yet his manner carried the reserve of a man who had already considered many remedies and found none practical. He had heard of the preserving room at Ashcombe Park. He did not question Cordelia's experience, but he doubted whether methods developed upon a large estate could be useful in a village with uneven stoves, limited sugar, and too few people at harvest time. A great house can purchase what it lacks, he said. Hollow Ash must manage with what it has. Cordelia looked beyond him, towards the rows of plum trees. That is what I have come to understand, she replied. She did not describe the results she had achieved at Ashcombe or try to persuade him with accounts of successful seasons. Instead, she asked to see the baskets used during picking, the carts that carried fruit to market, and the records of previous harvests. Walter showed her what he had kept. The figures were incomplete, but the pattern was plain. When the crop was light, nearly all the plums could be sold. When the crop was abundant, the amount taken to market increased, while the price received for each basket fell. Once the price dropped below the cost of picking and transport, some fruit was no longer gathered at all. Cordelia asked how long the journey to the larger county market required, and how many baskets could be carried without crushing the lower fruit. She examined the packing shed, the distance from the furthest trees to the road, and the number of workers Walter could usually employ. By the time she left, she had made several pages of notes and offered no promise that the coming season would be different. Each evening, Cordelia returned to the small table beneath her bedroom window. The old recipe book opened easily at the pages most often used at Ashcombe. Its instructions assumed the presence of copper pans, ample shelves, steady heat, and several pairs of trained hands. Those methods could not simply be copied into the kitchens she had visited. On loose sheets of paper, she began reducing the quantities. She considered how much fruit could be safely cooked in the smaller pans, and how much sugar the families could reasonably purchase. She calculated the time required to heat jars upon narrow stoves, and marked the stages of the work that might be shared between neighbors. Every altered method had to depend upon tools already present in hollow ash, and upon the number of people the village could truly spare. Slowly, the columns of figures began to resemble something more than an account of insufficiency. One household had a large stove but too few jars. Another had sound jars and a dry storeroom but no spare labor. A third could purchase sugar, while a fourth possessed a cart strong enough to carry finished goods to market. Separately, none had what was needed. Together, they might. At the end of her second week, Prue asked whether Cordelia had seen enough to return to the town and consider the matter from there. Cordelia looked out at the nearest orchard. The last white petals had disappeared, leaving the small green fruit visible along the branches. The plums would continue growing, whether the village prepared for them or not. By summer, the branches would bend beneath a harvest whose size no single kitchen could manage. She closed the recipe book, leaving the new pages between its older ones. Cordelia would remain in hollow ash for one season. She could not promise Prue that the fruit would be saved, nor could she yet tell Walter Griggs that his doubts were mistaken. Before offering the village a plan, she needed to understand more than its orchards and equipment. She needed to learn how each household worked, what each family already knew, and how much change they might reasonably accept. And so, on the following morning, Cordelia began again at the first cottage door. The first cottage door opened only a little when Cordelia knocked. The woman inside had already spoken with her during the earlier visits and had allowed her pans and jars to be counted. Yet it was one thing to answer questions about the previous harvest, and another to invite a stranger into the habits of a kitchen. Cordelia did not attempt to enter before she was asked. She explained that Prue Hollis had offered the use of the vicarage kitchen for a small preserving lesson the following Thursday afternoon. Anyone might attend. No payment was required, and no one would be asked to abandon a method that already worked. The woman listened, thanked her, and said she would consider it. Cordelia received similar answers at the next several houses. Some women appeared interested until they learned that others would be present. A few said they had made jam all their lives and saw little purpose in watching another woman do the same. Others accepted the invitation, but spoke with the careful politeness reserved for something they had not yet decided to trust. By Thursday, Prue had cleared the long table in the vicarage kitchen. A small quantity of plums had been weighed and washed. The jars stood beside the range, and Cordelia's thermometer, fruit knife, and 2 wooden spoons lay upon a folded cloth. 7 women came. 3 sat around the table. 2 remained near the dresser, keeping their aprons on as though they intended to leave before the lesson was finished. The others stood beside the open door, where they could see the stove without appearing to have committed themselves to staying. Among those nearest the door was Effie Marsh, a broad-shouldered woman with silver hair drawn tightly beneath a white cap. She had lived in hollow ash since her marriage and had made jam for more than 40 years. Her pantry shelves were said to hold enough preserves to carry her household through any winter, and she did not disguise her opinion that experience earned in a large estate kitchen might have little to teach a woman who had cooked over the same range since before Cordelia came to Ashcombe Park. Cordelia began without addressing the doubt in the room. She placed the empty preserving pan upon the scales, recorded its weight, and then added the prepared fruit. She explained that guessing by the size of a bowl could produce a different result each time, because one variety held more water than another, and fruit gathered after rain behaved differently from fruit ripened through dry weather. The amount of sugar had to answer the condition and quantity of the fruit, rather than the appearance of the vessel containing it. She did not speak as if the women knew nothing. Most of them already understood that underripe plums required different handling from soft ones, and that a damp harvest produced more liquid in the pan. Cordelia gave names and measurements to judgments they had often made by instinct, showing how those observations could be written down and repeated. While the fruit heated, she prepared the jars. She examined each rim for small chips, then washed the jars in hot water and kept them warm beside the range. A jar filled while cold might crack, she explained, and one allowed to stand open after cleaning could collect dust from the kitchen before the preserve entered it. The lids and covers had to be prepared before the jam was ready, because there would be no time to begin searching for them once the correct setting point had been reached. Effie watched the jars with an expression of restrained impatience. "I have never weighed a plum in my kitchen," she said at last, "and I have not yet lost a winter for want of jam." Cordelia continued stirring until the sugar had dissolved. "I do not doubt that you know your own pan and stove better than I do, Mrs. Marsh." The answer removed the argument Effie had expected. For a moment, only the small movement of the wooden spoon against the pan could be heard. Cordelia then asked whether, across 40 years of preserving, Effie had ever opened a cupboard before Christmas and found that 1 or 2 jars had fermented beneath their covers or developed mold around the rim. Effie's reply did not come immediately. 1 or 2, she admitted. In wet years. Cordelia nodded. She did not treat the admission as proof that Effie's method had failed. Instead, she asked whether the spoiled jars had belonged to the final batches, when the fruit had been especially soft and the household tired from several days of work. Effie considered this before answering. They had. From that small agreement, the first useful conversation began. Effie described the way she tested her jam by allowing a little to fall from the spoon. Cordelia showed her how she used a cold plate to observe whether the surface wrinkled when touched. Another woman asked why some jars remained bright while others darkened before winter. Cordelia explained the effect of prolonged heating and showed them how a wider pan could reduce the time required for excess water to evaporate. When the jam reached its setting point, she removed it from the heat rather than continuing to boil it for safety. She allowed the bubbles to settle, filled the warm jars without touching their inner rims, and sealed each one while the contents were still hot. Every movement had been arranged before it became necessary. The finished batch was small. 7 jars stood upon the table, their color still clear in the afternoon light. Cordelia wrote the quantity of fruit, the amount of sugar, and the cooking time upon a sheet of paper, leaving space beneath for the women to record how the preserve had kept. No one declared the lesson a success. The jars would have to stand unopened for weeks before their seals and color could be properly judged. But when the women left, Effie Marsh took one copy of Cordelia's measurements with her. Several days later, Cordelia was invited to Effie's kitchen. She approached the visit as she had promised. She had not come to inspect the room or replace everything Effie had learned through 40 years of work. She stood beside the older woman's range, watched how its heat gathered more strongly beneath one side of the pan, and asked where the jars were usually kept after filling. Effie's methods were sound in most respects. She chose fruit carefully, cleaned her equipment well, and could judge the changing thickness of a preserve without consulting a clock. Cordelia suggested only that the jars remain hot until the moment of filling, and that the final batches be divided into smaller quantities when the fruit was very soft. A smaller pan would reach the proper setting point sooner, reducing the risk that tired hands might leave it boiling too long. Effie tried the changes without promising to keep them. Other invitations followed. In one cottage, Cordelia showed a young mother how to prepare all the covers before placing fruit upon the fire, so she would not have to leave the pan unattended. In another, she found that the preserves themselves had been properly cooked but stored against a damp outer wall. The jars were moved to a higher shelf on the opposite side of the room. Elsewhere, she advised a family to stop using 3 jars whose rims were too badly chipped to seal, though the glass itself appeared otherwise sound. At every house, Cordelia repeated that she had come to look at the work with them. She did not begin with Ashcombe's rules. She first watched the family's existing method, from the washing of the fruit to the storing of the finished jars. Whatever had worked safely for many seasons remained. She changed only the steps most likely to introduce dirt, trap air, or leave the preserve insufficiently heated. The villagers began referring to her as the woman who taught preserving, though the description made the work sound more one-sided than it was. Cordelia brought measurements, records, and 20 years of observation. The women of Hollow Ash brought knowledge of their own ranges, their own fruit, and the limited hours available within each household. The useful method lay somewhere between the two. Nell first appeared at the vicarage kitchen during the second lesson. She was 13 years old, narrow in the shoulders and dressed in a brown frock that had been lengthened at the hem with a strip of darker cloth. Her parents were dead, and she lived with a family of cousins for whom she carried water, minded younger children, and completed whatever errands could be fitted around the school day. Prue knew her as a quiet girl who was often sent from one side of Hollow Ash to the other with baskets, messages, or borrowed tools. At first, Nell stood outside the kitchen door. When one of the women asked for another cloth, she fetched it before Prue could move. Later, without being told, she gathered the used jars and carried them to the sink. Cordelia showed her how to wash them. The water had to be hot enough to clean the glass thoroughly, but the jars should not be placed suddenly into water much hotter than themselves. Nell listened without looking away. She rinsed each jar, turned it towards the window to inspect the rim, and set it upside down upon the clean cloth. At the next lesson, she asked whether she might weigh the sugar. Cordelia moved the scales towards her and showed her how to check that the pointer rested at 0 before anything was added. Nell measured the first quantity too quickly and had to remove 2 spoonfuls. The second time, she slowed as the pointer approached the mark. She then wiped the table, prepared the cold plate, and watched Cordelia test the jam. When the surface wrinkled beneath her fingertip, Nell bent closer, as though the slight movement contained an answer she had been waiting to see. Other people observed what Cordelia did. Nell wanted to understand why she did it. She asked what happened if too little sugar was added, why one pan had to be wider than another, and whether fruit gathered after rain should always be cooked longer. Cordelia answered each question seriously. When the answer depended upon the variety or ripeness of the fruit, she said so, rather than giving the girl a simpler rule that might later prove untrue. Walter Griggs did not attend any of the lessons. Cordelia saw him occasionally on the road or among the plum trees, where the young fruit had begun to grow heavier upon the branches. He greeted her courteously and asked Prue once whether many families were still listening to the new instructions, but he offered neither support nor objection. His daughter came to the vicarage on one afternoon and remained for the entire lesson. She said little, copied the instructions for sterilizing jars, and left before tea was served. Cordelia did not ask whether Walter had sent her. By the end of May, nearly 15 families had tried some part of Cordelia's method, with the strawberries and early cherries then coming into the village kitchens. The batches were small enough to be watched closely. Fewer jars failed to seal. The color of the fruit remained clearer, and several households began keeping simple notes of weight and cooking time. The results were better than before, but Cordelia understood that a handful of sound jars did not yet amount to the trust of a village. The plum harvest would be larger, faster, and far less forgiving. It would fill baskets more quickly than the kitchens could empty them, and place strain upon habits that seemed easy, while only one pan stood upon the stove. Until then, Cordelia's methods remained a collection of modest trials, accepted by some families and merely tolerated by others. Still, on most afternoons, someone came to the vicarage carrying a pan, a jar, or a question, and Nell was nearly always the first to arrive. Through June and the first weeks of July, Nell began coming to the vicarage kitchen whenever her work elsewhere in Hollow Ash had been finished. There was no fixed arrangement between her and Cordelia. Some afternoons she arrived shortly after the school bell, carrying an empty basket for Prue Hollis or returning a borrowed bowl to the dresser. On other days, the sun had already moved beyond the church roof before Cordelia heard her light steps in the passage. Nell might have spent the morning minding one of her cousin's children, carrying eggs to an elderly neighbor, or helping gather early fruit from a garden at the far end of the village. Yet if a pan stood upon the vicarage stove, she always found time to remain. The work during those weeks was quiet and small in scale. Strawberries arrived in shallow baskets, followed by cherries and the first gooseberries. Cordelia used them to continue the trials begun in May. Each batch allowed her to test a different pan, alter a quantity, or observe how fruit gathered in wet weather behaved upon an uneven stove. Nell washed the jars and examined their rims against the window. She removed stalks from the fruit, folded clean cloths, and measured sugar upon the scales. When Cordelia wrote down the weight of a batch, Nell watched the figures as attentively as she watched the changing surface of the preserve. Her questions came steadily. She wanted to know why some fruit was left whole while other fruit had to be cut. She asked why sugar should be warmed before it entered one pan, but not another, why bubbles changed size as water left the mixture, and why Cordelia sometimes removed a preserve from the stove before it appeared thick enough to spread. Cordelia answered every question as carefully as she would have answered an adult assistant at Ashcombe Park. If there was no single answer, she said so. A soft fruit gathered after rain required a different judgment from firm fruit ripened through several warm days. One stove might bring a pan to the correct heat in 20 minutes, while another took longer. The numbers in a recipe were useful, but they could not replace observation. Nell never appeared disappointed when an answer required more thought rather than less. She seemed to prefer explanations that gave her something further to notice. As they worked, she also spoke about the households Cordelia had visited. Because Nell carried messages and completed errands throughout Hollow Ash, she knew which kitchens were busiest in the morning, which families shared a cart, and which women might attend a lesson only if someone else watched their children. She knew that one household had more jars than Cordelia had counted, because a box of them was kept in an upstairs cupboard. She knew that another family appeared reluctant to purchase sugar because payment for the previous season's fruit had arrived later than expected. These were not secrets deliberately kept from Cordelia. They were small facts belonging to the daily movement of the village, visible most clearly to someone who passed regularly through its kitchens, gardens, and yards. Cordelia began asking Nell practical questions before arranging each new trial. If she intended to visit a cottage in the afternoon, she asked whether that hour would interfere with milking or school collection. If she hoped to borrow a wider pan, Nell usually knew where one might be spared without inconveniencing the owner. It was through one of these conversations that Cordelia first understood why several families remained especially cautious of advice brought from outside Hollow Ash. Years earlier, when disease had appeared among the livestock, a man from the city had come to the village with a treatment he said would prevent further loss. He had spoken confidently and instructed several families to follow his method. Because he carried printed papers and appeared certain of his knowledge, people had trusted him. The treatment had failed. Some of the affected animals had not recovered, and several families had suffered losses they could ill afford. The man had returned to the city soon afterwards. He had not remained to see how the households managed without the animals they had lost, nor had he shared the cost of the failure. Nell told the story without bitterness. She had been younger when it happened and remembered only parts of the event herself, but it had been repeated often enough in the village that nearly everyone knew its lesson. People who arrived with confidence could also leave with ease. The people of Hollow Ash could not. Cordelia continued removing cherry stones while Nell spoke. Until then, she had understood the villagers' reserve chiefly as a response to the difference between their kitchens and the preserving room at Ashcombe. She had believed that they feared being judged by the standards of a large estate or asked to purchase equipment they could not afford. That was only part of it. Their hesitation did not come from an unwillingness to learn. They had once accepted a stranger's certainty and paid for it after the stranger was gone. Cordelia could not ask them to forget that experience merely because her own intentions were different, nor could she prove herself trustworthy by describing 20 successful seasons in another place. Ashcombe's records showed what she had done there. They did not guarantee what would happen in Hollow Ash. After that afternoon, she became still more careful about the manner in which she offered each change. She stopped speaking of methods the village should adopt and began describing trials that one or two households might choose to make. A family could prepare half its fruit in the usual way and half according to an altered measurement. The jars could then be stored upon the same shelf and examined together after several weeks. If the new method produced no improvement, it need not be repeated. When she suggested warming jars more thoroughly, she first demonstrated the change with 4 jars rather than asking a household to alter an entire day's work. When she recommended dividing a large batch between 2 pans, she recorded the time and fuel required so that the family could decide whether the result justified the additional labor. Every trial remained small enough to stop. Every result could be seen. Cordelia made no promises about the coming plum harvest. When someone asked whether her methods would save all the fruit, she replied that she had not yet examined ripe plums from that season and could not know how quickly they would arrive. She could say only that clean jars, careful measurements, and shared observations had already reduced the number of failed batches among the early fruit. The villagers seemed to trust this restraint more than they would have trusted certainty. More women began bringing their own jars to the lessons. Effie Marsh returned twice and offered the use of her wider pan for an afternoon trial. Walter Griggs still did not attend, but when Cordelia passed him near the packing shed, he asked whether the seals upon the early preserves had held. She told him how many had failed and how many remained sound, giving him the figures without adding a conclusion he had not requested. The quiet afternoons continued. One day, rain settled over Hollow Ash and remained from morning until evening. Water ran from the vicarage roof, and the churchyard beyond the kitchen window became soft and indistinct. Nell arrived with the shoulders of her brown frock darkened by the weather. There was no fruit waiting to be prepared, so she and Cordelia inspected empty jars, cut clean covers, and copied the results of the recent trials onto loose sheets. Nell was drying the last jar when she asked whether Cordelia missed Ashcombe Park. Cordelia did not answer at once. She still remembered the northern light in the preserving room and the sound of the large copper pan settling upon the stove. She remembered the arrival of the first strawberries, the smell of warm black currants, and the particular silence of the room after a long day when the final jar had been sealed. At times, her hands missed the certainty of reaching for a tool and finding it in the place where it had stood for 20 years. "I miss the work," she said. Nell waited, sensing that the answer was not complete. Cordelia folded the cloth upon which the jars had been drying. "But I do not miss belonging to a place that could be sold without my having any voice in what became of it." The sentence was quieter than Nell's question had been. Cordelia had not formed the thought so plainly before speaking it. At Ashcombe, she had believed that 20 years of careful labor had given her a place within the house. Yet the preserving room, the orchards and the methods she had established had belonged to someone else. When the estate changed hands, her connection to them could be ended by a conversation lasting only a few minutes. Hollow Ash had promised her nothing. Still, each small trial depended upon people choosing to take part. A jar placed upon a cottage shelf remained part of a decision made by the household that would later open it. The work advanced more slowly because no single person possessed the authority to order the whole village to follow one method. Cordelia was beginning to understand that the slowness was not entirely a weakness. On the following clear afternoon, Prue received a basket of gooseberries from a garden near the schoolroom. They were firm and newly gathered, with no split skins or bruising. Cordelia set them upon the vicarage table before Nell arrived. Until then, the girl had completed separate parts of the work. She had washed jars, weighed sugar, and observed the setting point, but Cordelia had remained responsible for the order of each batch. That afternoon, she placed the recipe sheet beside Nell. The gooseberry preserve would be Nell's to make from beginning to end. Cordelia showed her how to sort the fruit, removing any berry that might affect the rest. Nell weighed what remained, recorded the quantity, and prepared the jars before the pan was heated. She trimmed the fruit carefully, added the measured water, and watched until the skins softened. Only then did she add the sugar. Cordelia stood beside her, but did not take the spoon from her hand. She reminded Nell to observe the whole surface of the pan rather than one point near the edge. When the preserve began to boil, Nell adjusted the heat and marked the time. She cooled a small spoonful upon a plate, tested it, waited a little longer, and tested again. At the second attempt, the surface wrinkled faintly beneath her finger. Nell looked towards Cordelia. Cordelia looked at the plate, then nodded. The pan was removed from the stove. Nell allowed the preserve to settle, filled the warm jars, and cleaned each rim before sealing it. Her movements were slower than Cordelia's, but nothing had to be repeated. When the jars stood in a row upon the table, Nell wrote the date, the weight of the fruit, the amount of sugar, and the cooking time upon the working sheet. Her handwriting was smaller and less even than Cordelia's, though every figure could be clearly read. There were only 6 jars. They did not solve the approaching difficulty of the plum harvest, and no one beyond the vicarage would know who had prepared them unless Nell chose to say so. But for the first time, Cordelia had not merely been assisted. She had taught someone else the whole order of the work, and Nell had remembered it. By the first days of August, the 6 jars of gooseberry preserve Nell had prepared were still standing upon a shelf in the vicarage pantry, their seals unbroken and their color unchanged. Whenever Nell passed the open pantry door, her eyes moved towards them. She did not ask to take one home, nor did she speak of them as though their successful appearance had proved anything. Cordelia had taught her that preserves were judged not only on the afternoon they were made, when the glass was warm and the color at its brightest, but after time had tested the seal and revealed whether the work had been carried out carefully enough. The jars would remain where they were. Outside the vicarage, however, there was less time for waiting. The summer had become unusually warm. For several weeks, the mornings had begun beneath a pale, cloudless sky, and by noon, the air among the orchards stood almost without movement. Grass dried along the edges of the lanes, dust gathered upon the leaves nearest the road, and the stream running through hollow ash became narrow enough for children to cross without wetting their shoes. The warmth altered the fruit more quickly than anyone had expected. At the end of July, Cordelia had still believed the first substantial plum harvest lay several weeks ahead. The young fruit had been firm beneath its green skin, and most growers expected the usual interval between the early varieties and the heavier crop that followed. Yet within a few days, Colour began appearing upon the branches. Pershore plums softened from green to yellow beneath the leaves, while the first Victoria plums developed faint areas of red along the sides, turned towards the sun. Nell brought the news from the eastern cottages before breakfast one morning. 2 families had already found ripe fruit beneath their trees. By afternoon, another basket arrived at the vicarage from an orchard nearer the schoolroom. The plums were not damaged or overripe, but they had reached a stage that ordinarily belonged to the latter part of the month. Cordelia cut one open upon the kitchen table. The stone separated easily from the flesh. Juice gathered along the blade of the fruit knife, and the scent rising from the opened plum was full and sweet. It was not merely fruit colored early by the sun, it was ready, nearly 3 weeks before the village had prepared to receive it. During the following days, Cordelia and Nell walked through the nearer orchards. The change was visible everywhere. Branches that had appeared comfortably upright in June now leaned beneath the growing weight. Wooden supports had been placed beneath several of the older trees, and more were being carried from sheds. Wherever the leaves were moved aside, fruit appeared in numbers greater than Cordelia had seen during her spring inspections. The blossom had set with unusual success. Little had been lost to late frost, and the warm weather had allowed the fruit to swell quickly. From the records kept by several growers, and from the number of branches already requiring support, the harvest was estimated at almost twice the size of the previous years. In another season, such abundance might have been welcomed without reservation. Yet the early ripening meant that orchards usually harvested at different times were now approaching readiness together. Families who had expected to finish gathering one variety before beginning upon another would have to work across several rows at once. Carts, baskets, and pickers would all be required during the same short period. The kitchens faced the same difficulty. Cordelia had helped the households improve their methods, but no careful measurement could enlarge a stove. A family that had learned to produce 12 sound jars from one basket still could not cook 6 baskets in the time it took the remaining fruit to soften. The trials of spring had reduced waste within individual batches. They had not yet created enough space, labor, or equipment to manage twice the ordinary harvest. News from the markets reached Hollow Ash before the first large picking began. Other villages had experienced the same warm weather. Their plums were ripening early as well, and the traders knew that within days the roads would be filled with carts carrying more fruit than the local markets could absorb. The first prices offered were already lower than those received during the previous summer. Then they fell again. Growers continued examining their trees, counting baskets that had not yet been filled, and calculating what the fruit might bring if sold at the price then being offered. Some could wait a little longer in the hope that the market would improve. Others knew that ripe plums could not be stored like apples. Once gathered, they had only a short interval before bruising and warmth made them unsuitable for sale. Walter Griggs came to the vicarage late one afternoon, carrying several folded sheets from his orchard records. He had spent the morning with a trader who purchased fruit for the larger market at Worcester. The man was willing to take part of Walter's crop, but only at a price considerably below what had been paid the year before. If the remaining plums ripened as quickly as expected, the trader might lower his offer further or refuse additional loads altogether. Prue took Walter into the parlour, where Cordelia was reviewing the lists she had made during her first weeks in Hollow Ash. Nell remained at the table near the window, copying the number of sound jars available in each household. Walter placed his records beside Cordelia's papers. His estimates were more exact than those he had shown her in April. He had counted the trees likely to produce heavily, calculated the average number of baskets from each row, and compared the result with the previous season. Even allowing for fruit lost to birds, insects, and ordinary damage, the crop would be close to twice the size of the last one. Cordelia examined the figures without hurrying. She asked how much of the harvest had already been promised, how many pickers he could employ, and how long the earliest varieties might remain upon the branches. Walter answered each question directly. If he sold the plums at the price then offered, the return would scarcely cover the gathering and transport. If he left them upon the trees, he would lose not only the crop, but much of the income upon which his household and orchard depended through winter. By Walter's calculation, the loss might amount to nearly half his family's yearly income. He did not speak of ruin, nor did he ask Cordelia to make a promise. The figures lay between them, plainly enough. Beyond the open window, the afternoon remained warm, and a few bees moved among the flowers near the vicarage wall. Cordelia turned to the lists gathered during the spring. Hollow Ash possessed more than 100 usable jars among its households, though many were already intended for domestic stores. There were several large pans, but they stood in separate kitchens. 3 ranges could hold 2 preserving vessels at once. Effie Marsh owned the widest pan Cordelia had inspected. 2 families had dry storerooms. Walter had carts, baskets, and enough shed space to sort fruit before it was carried elsewhere. Other households could provide labor for part of a day, though few could spare the same people from morning until evening. Everything required to begin the work existed somewhere in the village. It did not exist in one place. Cordelia explained that the lessons of the previous months had prepared them to make better preserves, but not enough of them. If each family attempted to manage its own fruit alone, the stoves would become crowded, sugar would run short, and baskets would wait outside while the women worked through the night. The fruit would continue ripening more quickly than the separate kitchens could use it. Walter looked down at the figures he had brought. In spring, he had reminded Cordelia that Hollow Ash must manage with what it possessed. She had agreed with him then, and she did not withdraw that agreement now. But what Hollow Ash possessed belonged to many households. If the stoves, pans, jars, carts, and available hands were considered together, the village might preserve far more than any family could manage alone. Fruit could be sorted before it entered the kitchens. The firmest plums could be sent to market, while those too ripe to travel could be cooked at once. One household might wash jars, another prepare fruit, and the larger ranges could be kept working without requiring every task to be performed in the same room. The idea was simple when described in this way. Carrying it out would not be. Families would have to lend equipment they depended upon. Sugar would need to be purchased before the preserves had been sold. Someone would have to decide whose fruit was cooked first, how the finished jars were counted, and how any later payment should be divided. No single grower could make those decisions for the others, and Cordelia had neither the authority nor the wish to make them alone. Walter gathered his records, though he did not fold them immediately. For the first time since Cordelia had met him, his reserve appeared, directed not towards her knowledge, but towards the size of the work before them. "The others will need to hear the figures," he said. Cordelia nodded. They would also need to hear exactly what she believed could be done, what remained uncertain, and how little time they possessed before the earliest fruit began to fall. That evening, Prue unlocked the parish hall and opened its windows to release the heat held beneath the roof. Nell carried chairs from the walls and arranged them in rows, while Cordelia placed the orchard estimates beside her lists of jars, stoves, pans, and available rooms. Messages went from house to house before sunset. No one was told that a solution had been found. The growers and their families were asked only to come the following evening, bring what records they possessed, and listen to what the approaching harvest would require of them. Beyond the churchyard, the orchards darkened slowly beneath the summer sky. Here and there, a ripe plum released its hold upon a branch and fell quietly into the grass. The harvest had begun before hollow ash was ready. In less than 3 weeks, much of it might be lost. That same evening, the parish hall was filled long before the appointed hour. The heat of the day remained beneath its roof, despite the windows having been opened towards the churchyard. Men and women came in from every part of hollow ash, some directly from the orchards, others from kitchens where the evening meal had been prepared earlier than usual. Growers sat beside labourers who had picked their fruit in previous seasons. Women who had attended Cordelia's preserving lessons occupied the front benches, while several older children stood quietly along the walls after the last chairs had been taken. Nearly every household in the village depended upon the plum harvest in some measure. For Walter Griggs and the other larger growers, the fruit provided a considerable part of the year's income. For families with only a few trees, the money paid for coal, boots, repairs, or food during the colder months. Even those who owned no orchard earned wages from picking, carrying baskets, or helping the growers prepare fruit for market. The people before Cordelia had therefore come for more than a discussion about plums. They had come because the branches beyond the village were already bending beneath a harvest that might be worth very little if it could not be used within the next 10 days. Cordelia stood behind a long table near the front of the room. She had brought the notes made during her spring visits, the figures supplied by Walter, and the lists of stoves, pans, jars, and available workers gathered from the village households. Nell sat at one end of the table with an open ledger, several sharpened pencils, and the careful attention she had learned to give every quantity Cordelia placed before her. Prue Hollis called the meeting to order, though little was required to quieten the room. The families had already seen the early fruit beneath their own trees and heard the falling prices offered by the traders. They did not need to be persuaded that a difficult harvest was approaching. Prue explained that Cordelia had prepared a plan. It would require nearly every plum-growing household to take part, and it could not succeed if each family continued working alone. Nothing would be decided without the village hearing the entire proposal first. Then she gave the room to Cordelia. Cordelia did not begin by assuring them that the fruit could be saved. She had made no such promise to Walter, and she would not make one now simply because more people were listening. Instead, She described what would happen if they followed their ordinary arrangements. The earliest plums were already ripe. Within 10 days, much of the remaining fruit would become too soft to travel and too abundant for the local market. Separate households could preserve only a small part of what their own trees produced. Even families with sound recipes and experienced hands would be limited by the size of their stoves, the number of jars in their cupboards, and the hours available before the fruit began to spoil. The village could not create more time. It could, however, stop wasting the time and equipment it already possessed by keeping them divided among separate houses. Cordelia placed a large sheet of paper upon the table. Across it, she had written the stages through which the harvest would have to pass: picking, sorting, cooking, filling, labeling, and recording. The village would be divided into groups, with each group responsible for one part of the work. Those accustomed to the orchards would begin with the picking. They would gather the fruit by area rather than moving between scattered trees, allowing carts and baskets to follow them without unnecessary delay. At the end of each row, the plums would be carried to the sorting tables instead of being sent immediately to individual homes. The sorting group would separate the fruit according to ripeness. The softest plums, provided they remained sound, would be taken directly to the kitchens and cooked into jam that same day. Fruit that had fully ripened but still held its shape would be prepared for plum wine. The firmer plums, which could endure cutting and slower preparation without collapsing, would be sent to the drying group. Nothing suitable for one purpose would be left waiting for another. 3 houses possessed kitchens large enough to carry out the greater part of the cooking. Their ranges would be used in shifts. No household would be expected to surrender its kitchen without time to prepare ordinary meals, and no stove would be kept working beyond the hours its owner had agreed to provide. The schedule would be arranged so that one group prepared fruit while another cooked, allowing each kitchen to receive the next measured quantity as soon as a pan became available. Cordelia had used such divided work at Ashcombe Park, although never under conditions exactly like these. At the estate, the preserving room, storerooms, and orchard workers had all belonged to one household. In Hollow Ash, the same order would have to be created across several cottages and among families who remained responsible for their own homes. That difference made the written record essential. Every household would have its fruit weighed before it entered the work. The ledger would also record the hours supplied by each family and every contribution of sugar, jars, bottles, fuel, cloth, labels, or other materials. Finished goods would be counted as they left the kitchens, and again when they were placed in storage. If the jam, wine, and dried plums were sold, the expenses would first be removed from the money received. The remaining profit would then be divided according to the fruit, labor, and materials each household had contributed. Cordelia did not claim that every plum would produce the same return. Some fruit would lose weight during drying. Stones and damaged portions would have to be removed. Sugar and fuel would be used differently by the 3 methods. The records would therefore have to remain exact from the first basket until the last jar had been labeled. Nell's pencil moved steadily over the ledger as Cordelia spoke. Beside each stage, she began a list of the people who had the experience or time required to carry it out. The room remained quiet for several moments after Cordelia finished explaining the plan. The people of Hollow Ash were not confused by what she had said. The difficulty lay in understanding how much the plan required them to place into one another's hands. A grower would have to trust someone else to weigh his fruit. A woman lending jars would have to believe that they would be counted before leaving her kitchen. Those working beside the pans would be responsible for plums gathered from trees that did not belong to them. If the goods sold, each family would have to accept a division based upon figures written across 10 long days of work. Effie Marsh rose from the second bench. She had attended enough of Cordelia's lessons to know that the methods produced sound preserves. Her doubt concerned something no clean jar or careful measurement could answer. "What happens if we work for 10 days?" she asked, "and no one buys what we make?" No one shifted upon the benches. It was the question that had remained beneath every other thought in the room. Cordelia rested one hand upon the papers before her. She could have spoken about the quality of the early batches, or reminded them of her 20 years at Ashcombe. She could have described the greater value of preserves, compared with fruit sold cheaply to a trader. Yet none of these things would guarantee that customers at the larger market would purchase goods made by a village whose name they did not know. "If the goods do not sell," she said, "then the work will not return what we have put into it." Her answer was plain enough to leave no shelter behind it. Cordelia then explained that the methods themselves had been tested at a larger scale. She knew how to organize workers, judge the different stages of the fruit, maintain consistent batches, and keep records from the first weighing to the final store. She believed Hollow Ash possessed enough hands, kitchens, and materials to carry out the plan. But belief was not a promise of success. What she could promise was that she would remain in Hollow Ash throughout the entire 10 days. She would not give instructions and leave the village to bear the result alone. She would work beside the cooking groups, examine the fruit, check the measurements, and accept responsibility for every decision she asked them to follow. The silence that came afterwards was longer than the first. Cordelia did not attempt to fill it. Her years at Ashcombe had taught her that some changes could not be hurried by further explanation. The villagers had heard the figures and understood the risk. The decision now belonged to them. Walter Griggs stood. He had entered the hall with the same reserve he had shown Cordelia from the beginning. He still possessed no certainty that preserves, wine and dried fruit would replace the income his family might lose at the fresh market. Yet he had examined his trees, spoken with the traders, and calculated what would happen if he continued in the ordinary way. He had no better plan. Walter said that his household and orchard workers would take part. His fruit could be entered into the common record, and his carts could be used wherever the schedule required them. The agreement came from the most doubtful man in the room. After Walter resumed his seat, another grower gave his name. A woman near the front offered the use of her kitchen during the afternoon shift. Effie Marsh said she would supervise one of the jam pans. 2 families offered jars and bottles. Others agreed to pick, sort, cut, carry, wash, label, or keep the fires steady. The responses did not rise into excitement. They passed through the hall one at a time, measured and practical, until nearly every family had committed something to the work. Nell filled page after page. By the time the meeting ended, the village had not yet preserved a single plum from the main harvest. No goods had been sold, and no one knew whether the 10 days ahead would justify what they had agreed to risk. But the separate kitchens, orchards, and pairs of hands had been placed within one plan. Cordelia returned to her room late that night. The village had grown quiet, though the warm scent of ripe plums still travelled from the orchards through the open window. She lit the lamp, removed her recipe book from its case, and opened it upon the table. For several hours, she calculated the sugar required for the first batches, the number of jars available, the heating time for each pan, and the order in which the 3 kitchens would work. She divided the days into shifts and placed the picking, sorting, and cooking groups beside one another until fruit could pass between them without being left unnecessarily long in baskets. The work before her was larger than anything she had attempted since leaving Ashcombe Park. Yet as the columns took shape beneath her hand, Cordelia felt a rhythm return that she had feared was gone. It was the familiar rhythm of quantities waiting to be measured, fires waiting to be lit, and ripe fruit that could not be asked to delay. For the first time since Ashcombe had ceased to need her, another harvest was waiting for Cordelia Vane. The first picking began before sunrise. In the half-light, the orchards of hollow ash seemed larger than they had during Cordelia's spring visits. Rows of trees descended along the gentle slopes beyond the village, their branches bowed beneath Pershore and Victoria plums that had ripened almost 3 weeks before the usual time. Dew still lay upon the grass, but the air already carried the warmth that would gather after morning. The villagers began with the eastern orchards, where the fruit was softest. Cordelia moved among the first rows before the baskets were opened. She reminded the pickers that speed alone would not save the harvest. If every plum were dropped into the same container, the ripe fruit would be crushed beneath the firmer layers before it reached the kitchens. The sorting had to begin beneath the trees. 3 kinds of baskets were placed at the end of each row. The softest plums, provided their skins remained sound, were laid carefully into shallow baskets and marked for the jam kitchens. Fruit that had fully ripened but still held its shape was set aside for the plum wine. The firmer plums were placed separately and carried to the drying group. Nothing was piled deeply enough for the lower fruit to bruise beneath the weight. At first, the arrangement slowed the work. Pickers accustomed to filling a basket before considering the condition of its contents had to pause and examine each plum. Several carried fruit to the wrong place and returned to move it again. Nell stood near the weighing table with the ledger open, checking the marks upon the baskets before recording the orchard and household from which each quantity had come. By the middle of the morning, the order had become more natural. Hands began recognizing firmness, almost without stopping. The smallest children carried empty baskets back towards the trees, while the older workers moved the filled ones into the shade. Carts traveled between the orchards and the village, taking the ripest fruit first and leaving the firmer plums only long enough for the drying group to prepare them. Cordelia remained near the sorting tables until she was certain that each group understood the distinction. A plum suitable for drying could wait longer than one already warm and yielding beneath the fingers. Fruit for jam could not be left at the bottom of a cart while a kitchen finished another batch. The order in which the baskets moved mattered as much as the order in which the pans were filled. By noon, the first tables were stained with pale yellow and dark red juice. Leaves clung to the grass beneath the weighing station, and the sweet scent of opened fruit had begun to draw wasps from the hedges. Yet scarcely any sound plums lay discarded. The first day was spent almost entirely in the eastern orchards. On the second morning, the pickers moved westward, working through the trees nearest Walter Griggs's land before continuing towards the smaller household plots. The figures in Nell's ledger grew quickly. Each delivery was weighed before leaving the orchard and checked again when it reached its appointed group. Beside the quantity, Nell recorded whether the fruit had gone to jam, wine, or drying. When a basket contained plums from 2 households, she sent it back to be separated rather than making an estimate that might later be disputed. Cordelia saw the correction from a distance and did not intervene. Nell had understood why the figures mattered. By the end of the second day, the first areas had been cleared of fruit that could no longer remain upon the branches. Some firmer plums were still left to ripen, but the immediate pressure upon those orchards had been reduced. The harvest had not been saved. It had merely been placed in motion before the heat could overtake it. On the third day, the 3 largest kitchens began working in shifts. Their fires were lit before the first baskets arrived. Jars had been washed and placed ready for heating. Cloths, knives, labels and weighing scales stood upon tables cleared of ordinary household objects. The work of preparing meals had been arranged around the preserving hours, and each family knew when its range would be required for cooking and when it must be returned to the household. Cordelia began at the kitchen nearest the eastern lane. She examined the first fruit, checked the weight of sugar, and watched the heat beneath the pan. When the mixture began to boil, she waited until the woman responsible could recognize the change in the bubbles and the heavier movement of the spoon through the fruit. Only then did she leave for the next house. Nell followed with the ledger and a smaller collection of working sheets. At every kitchen, she entered the weight of fruit received, the amount of sugar used, and the number of jars filled. She carried corrections to the sorting group and informed the kitchens when a later basket had been redirected because another stove was ready sooner. The 3 rooms did not work at the same pace. One range heated quickly but required close attention to prevent the fruit from catching at the bottom. Another maintained a gentler heat and was better suited to larger batches. The third kitchen had more table space, allowing several people to prepare fruit while the pan remained occupied. Cordelia altered the quantities to suit each stove. She did not force the same written instruction upon 3 different fires. The measurements remained exact, but the time required depended upon the pan, the ripeness of the fruit, and the steadiness of the heat. The drying group worked more quietly. Firm plums were washed, cut, and arranged without overlap before being placed where warm air could move around them. Those preparing the wine handled the fruit that was fully ripe but not yet soft enough to collapse. Each quantity was measured and recorded before being placed into the clean vessels prepared for it. Throughout the 4th day, Carts continued arriving from the orchards. The kitchens grew hot long before noon. Steam clouded the windows, and the scent of cooking plums settled into curtains, aprons, and hair. Empty jars disappeared from the tables almost as soon as they were warmed. Filled jars were wiped, sealed, and marked before being carried away to make space for the next batch. There was little conversation beyond what the work required. A quantity was called out. A basket was directed towards a table. Someone asked for a clean cloth or confirmed the number of jars completed. The sound of wooden spoons against the sides of pans passed steadily through the rooms. Cordelia moved from one kitchen to another until the road between them seemed part of the preserving work itself. She checked the cleanliness of jar rims, examined the surface of each batch, and compared Nell's figures with the labels being attached to the finished goods. Whenever she found a difference, the work stopped long enough for the number to be corrected. On the fifth afternoon, the first serious mistake occurred at Walter Grigg's house. A large pan of jam had been placed over a fire that was burning more strongly than the person tending it realized. For several minutes, attention moved towards a new delivery arriving at the rear door. The mixture continued boiling without being drawn from the hottest part of the range. Cordelia smelled the change before she saw it. Beneath the sweetness of the plums was the darker scent of sugar beginning to burn. She crossed the kitchen and ordered the pan removed from the heat. The woman holding the spoon instinctively began to scrape the bottom, but Cordelia stopped her. Stirring would have drawn the burnt portion through the rest of the preserve. A clean pan was brought to the table. Without disturbing the layer that had caught beneath, they lifted the sound preserve from the top and transferred it carefully. The final portion was left behind with the burnt sugar. Cordelia examined what had been saved, then returned it to a gentler fire for only as long as it required. Most of the batch remained usable. The loss was far smaller than it might have been, yet the kitchen became unusually quiet. Until that moment, the system had appeared to be carrying the fruit forward with a steadiness that concealed how easily one mistake could affect the labor of many households. The plums in the pan had come from several orchards. The sugar had been purchased from the common supply. The hands that had washed, weighed, and prepared the fruit belonged to people working in different parts of the village. The woman responsible looked towards Cordelia, expecting reproach. None came. Cordelia recorded the amount lost and instructed Nell to mark the batch separately. She then reduced the fire, checked the next quantity, and placed another person beside the pan so that it would never again be left unwatched while fruit was delivered. The mistake was not hidden. It was corrected, recorded, and used to change the work that followed. Still, news of the burnt pan traveled quickly between the kitchens. For the remainder of the afternoon, people worked with a new caution. Several began asking whether the village had attempted too much. Hundreds of pounds of fruit had already entered the plan, while none of the finished goods had yet reached a buyer. Cordelia offered no assurance she could not prove. She returned to the next pan. By the sixth day, fatigue had become visible in every group. Fingers were sore from cutting and stoning plums. Shoulders ached from carrying baskets. The heat of the ranges seemed to remain in the kitchens even after the fires had been lowered for meals. Cloths had to be washed continually, tables scrubbed again, and the floors cleared of juice before the next shift began. The orchards demanded the same labor each morning. Branches that had been gathered clean the previous day stood lighter against the sky, but farther along the valley, more fruit had softened overnight. The pickers could see how much remained. Every cleared row revealed another waiting beyond it. Some villagers began counting the finished jars and wondering aloud who could possibly buy so many. The market at Worcester was larger than the local one, but Hollow Ash had never taken such a quantity there before. A sound seal did not guarantee a customer, neither did a careful label. Cordelia heard these concerns without dismissing them. She was tired as well. Her feet ached from walking between the orchards, kitchens, and parish store. The heat had reddened her hands, and each night she remained awake long enough to compare the day's totals with the plan for the morning. Yet when the first shift began, she was already beside the stove. She did not tell the others that success was certain. She checked the jars, she weighed the sugar, she lifted baskets, cleaned tables, and stood over the pans beside them. On the seventh morning, the work began again at the appointed hour because Cordelia was there to begin it. The steadiness of her presence did more than encouragement could have done. The villagers had once learned to distrust people who arrived with instructions and departed before the cost became clear. Cordelia had promised only that she would remain through the 10 days. Each morning made that promise visible. Nell now spent less time following directly behind her. She checked the working sheets before Cordelia arrived, compared the number of empty jars with the batches planned for the day, and warned one kitchen that it would run short before the afternoon shift. When 2 baskets reached the same stove at once, she examined their marks and sent the softer fruit forward while redirecting the firmer plums to the kitchen whose pan would soon be free. At another table, she found that the same batch number had been written upon 2 sets of labels. She crossed out the incorrect marks, entered the change in the ledger, and explained it to the woman filling the jars. Only after the work had continued did she tell Cordelia what she had done. Cordelia listened, checked the figures, and returned the ledger to her. Nell had made the correct decision. There was no reason to repeat it, merely so that the authority would appear to belong to someone older. During the final 3 days, the visible form of the harvest began to change. Fewer baskets stood beneath the orchard trees. In their place, rows of sealed jars gathered upon the cooling tables. The prepared plum wine was secured in its vessels, each one marked with its quantity and date. The dried plums were examined, weighed and packed only when no remaining moisture threatened their keeping. Every label had to match the ledger. Every finished quantity had to be counted before leaving the kitchen, and counted once more when it entered the parish store. Boxes were lined up beneath the windows, filled and closed. Jars were placed upright, with cloth between them, so that the glass would not strike together on the road to Worcester. The work slowed near the end, not because less remained to be done, but because the final order could not be hurried. A jar without a clear label, a box without a count or a quantity, entered beneath the wrong household would carry confusion into the division of payment later. Cordelia inspected the last shelves while Nell read the figures aloud. By the evening of the 10th day, the final pan had been emptied. The last jars were wiped and labelled. The remaining boxes were carried into the parish store, where the jam stood in long, close rows beneath the shelves, holding the other goods. The fires were allowed to fall. One by one, the villagers entered the store and stood beneath the oil lamps. Their aprons were stained, their hands were sore, and their faces showed the weariness of 10 days spent working against fruit that would not wait. No one spoke much. Before them stood hundreds of jars of plum jam, together with the wine and dried fruit prepared from the harvest. Beyond the walls, the orchards had been cleared of almost everything that could be saved. No family in Hollow Ash could have produced what now filled the room. Together they had done it, and beneath the quiet light of the lamps, they could finally see how much it was. Before dawn on the following morning, the yard beside the parish store was already filled with the subdued movement of people preparing to leave Hollow Ash. Lanterns hung from the sides of Walter Griggs's wagons, casting a pale amber light over the boxes arranged upon the ground. The plum jam had been packed upright, with folded cloth between the jars, while the dried plums were contained in smaller boxes that could be opened easily at the market. Each package carried the same simple label, the name of Hollow Ash, the kind of plum used, and the year of the harvest. The vessels of plum wine remained inside the store, where fermentation would continue until the contents were ready to be strained, settled, and sold at a later time. Nell stood beside the open door, with the ledger pressed against her coat. As every box was lifted onto a wagon, she checked its number against the previous night's record. Cordelia remained near the loading boards, examining the ropes and making certain that nothing could shift when the wheels reached the rougher parts of the road. No one wished to lose, through careless transport, what 10 days of careful work had preserved. The final wagon left Hollow Ash while the village windows were still dark. The road to Worcester extended for nearly 10 miles through orchards, pasture, and low fields covered by the faint mist that gathered before sunrise. The horses moved steadily beneath the weight of the goods, their harnesses sounding softly in the quiet morning. Cordelia rode beside Nell upon Walter's wagon, facing the rows of boxes whose contents had passed through so many hands before reaching them. Cordelia had travelled to county markets many times on behalf of Ashcombe Park, though never under circumstances quite like these. At the estate, the preserves had carried a name already known to prosperous households and established merchants. Hollow Ash possessed no such reputation. Its label described only a small village that most buyers had passed without reason to remember. By the time the wagons entered Worcester, morning light had begun to show upon the roofs and upper windows. Traders were already unloading vegetables, baskets of eggs, wheels of cheese, and late summer flowers. The air beneath the market roof held the mixed scents of damp straw, fruit, horse leather, and bread brought warm from nearby ovens. The space assigned to Hollow Ash was wider than any stall the village had occupied before. Walter's workers placed boards across the trestles and covered them with clean cloths. Boxes were opened in a careful order, and the jars were arranged in rows according to the kind of plum and the batch entered in Nell's ledger. Smaller dishes were set near the front for tasting, together with pieces of plain bread upon which the jam could be spread. The dried plums were placed in shallow trays so that buyers could examine their color and texture without opening the packages intended for sale. When the market opened, people passed the stall without stopping. Some glanced at the unfamiliar label and continued towards sellers they had used in previous years. Others slowed when they saw the number of jars, but seemed uncertain that a village stall could have produced so much without sacrificing quality. A few asked the price, then said they might return after seeing what else the market offered. Cordelia did not call after them. She had never believed that noise could improve a preserve. Instead, she remained behind the stall and answered the questions of those who chose to stop. She explained that the jam had been made from fruit preserved within hours of picking, rather than plums carried for days before reaching a factory. She described the difference between the Pershore batches, with their deeper and slightly sharper flavor, and the sweeter Victoria plum jam. She showed how the dried fruit could be stewed during winter, added to a pudding, or carried as food on a journey. The first purchases were small. One woman bought a single jar after tasting the Victoria plum jam. A man chose a packet of dried fruit but declined the larger quantity Cordelia suggested. Their coins made little change to the amount of stock covering the tables. Yet the open tasting jars began to do what explanation alone could not. People who had intended only to sample the jam paused after tasting it. The preserve held the flavor of the fruit, without allowing the sugar to conceal it. Its color remained clear, and the texture was firm enough to rest upon the bread without having been boiled into heaviness. Several customers returned with companions and asked them to try the difference for themselves. Before completing larger purchases, some buyers examined jars taken from separate rows. The consistency between them became as important as the taste of the first sample. The batches had been prepared in 3 different kitchens, upon ranges that heated at different speeds and by workers whose experience had not been equal. Nevertheless, the proportions, cleanliness, and careful supervision of the 10 days could be seen in the finished goods. One jar did not contain thin syrup, while another had been cooked almost solid. The labels were clear, the seals remained sound, and the fruit had been treated with the same attention throughout. The morning slowly changed around the store. The spaces left by sold jars grew wider. Nell brought forward new rows from the boxes beneath the tables and marked every sale in the ledger. Walter's workers repacked the empty crates so that they would occupy less room on the return journey. Effie watched customers taste jam from a batch she had supervised, saying little, though she examined each departing jar with the satisfaction of knowing the work inside it. By late morning, shopkeepers and boarding house proprietors had begun to stop. They were interested not in 1 or 2 jars, but in quantities sufficient to remain upon shelves or breakfast tables for several weeks. Cordelia answered their questions without offering claims the goods could not support. She explained, when each batch had been prepared, how it had been sealed and how the unopened jars should be stored. Shortly before noon, most of the jam intended for sale had disappeared from the tables. Only a small number of boxes remained unopened, together with several packets of dried plums. What had appeared too abundant when the stall was first arranged now occupied less space than the empty crates stacked behind it. One of the Worcester traders returned after visiting the stall twice during the morning. He opened jars selected from different batches, examined their contents, and compared the labels with the quantities Nell had recorded. He then asked whether hollow ash could provide preserves again after the following year's harvest. The price he proposed was considerably higher than the amount the village growers had recently been offered for their fresh plums. It would require the same consistency from one season to the next, and the trader would not accept poorly sealed jars merely because the fruit had come from the same orchards. Cordelia made no objection to those conditions. They were the conditions she would have required herself. No binding agreement could be completed before the village had considered the quantities it could promise. Even so, the trader wrote down the proposed order and the price he was prepared to pay. Walter folded the paper and placed it inside his coat with greater care than he had shown any of the offers made for his unprocessed fruit. When the market began to quieten, Nell and Cordelia counted the money at the back of the stall. They compared each payment with the goods recorded as sold, then removed the cost of sugar, jars, covers, and transport. The remaining sum was entered beside the contributions already listed for every household. Even after the expenses had been deducted, the return was substantially greater than the village would have received by accepting the trader's lowest prices for fresh plums. Fruit that might otherwise have softened beneath the trees had produced income instead of loss. The result could be followed through the ledger from the first basket weighed at hollow ash to the final coins counted in Worcester. Walter waited until Nell had checked the figures a second time. Then he approached Cordelia and held out his hand. He did not apologize for having doubted her, and Cordelia did not ask him to. His caution had belonged to the village's earlier experience, just as his agreement at the parish meeting had belonged to the moment when another course became necessary. She accepted his hand, and the understanding between them required nothing further. The wagons returned to Hollow Ash that afternoon, with their loads greatly reduced. Empty crates shifted lightly upon the boards, and the horses travelled more easily along the road between the fields. Nell kept the ledger upon her lap, opening it occasionally as though the written totals might have changed since Worcester. As the first plum orchards of Hollow Ash appeared beyond the hedges, she asked whether they would do the same work again the following year. Cordelia looked across the rows of trees from which the harvest had been gathered. The village kitchens had carried them through one urgent season, but the pans, tables, and workers could not be scattered and assembled anew each time the fruit began to ripen. "Yes," she said, "next year, and the years after that." Then she looked towards the parish store standing beyond the churchyard. "Hollow Ash will need a room made for the work." During the winter that followed the plum harvest, the people of Hollow Ash began to consider what should remain after the success of that single season. The orchard stood bare beneath pale skies, and the branches that had bent so heavily in August now held only rain and the occasional strip of dead leaf. The 3 kitchens used during the harvest had returned to their ordinary purposes. Pans had been placed back in cupboards. Tables once covered with fruit were again used for family meals, and the borrowed jars, baskets, and cloths had been counted and returned. Nothing visible remained of the 10 urgent days except the figures in Nell's ledger, the money divided among the participating households, and the goods still keeping upon the shelves of the parish store. Yet the village understood that the same difficulty would return with another abundant harvest. Their work had succeeded because nearly every household had surrendered part of its kitchen, equipment, and time. Such an arrangement could be managed during an emergency, but it could not remain the permanent foundation of the village's preserving work. If Hollow Ash intended to fulfill the Worcester traders' proposed order and continue selling goods at the larger markets, it could not begin each season by searching again for pans, clearing tables, and fitting its work between the meals of 3 separate families. A meeting was therefore held in the parish hall during the quietest part of winter. The gathering was smaller than the one called before the plum harvest, though nearly every family involved in the 10 days sent someone to attend. Nell reopened the ledger at the same long table. Walter Griggs brought the proposed order from Worcester, still folded carefully inside its envelope, while Prue Hollis placed before the room an account of the money that remained after expenses and household payments had been completed. Cordelia had prepared no grand plan for expansion. She presented only what Hollow Ash would require if it meant to repeat the work properly. 1 room, large enough for several people to prepare fruit together, a range capable of holding the preserving pans, a reliable place for washing and heating jars, shelves for finished goods, and dry storage for sugar, covers, labels, and clean cloths. The room did not need machinery, decorative fittings, or more space than the village could use. It needed to place every stage of the work within reach of the next. The parish store stood behind Prue's pantry, close to the churchyard and near enough to the main road for carts to approach without passing through a private garden. Beside it was a piece of unused ground wide enough for a new room. A doorway could connect the 2 buildings, allowing finished jars to pass directly from the working tables to the dry shelves where they would be counted and stored. The families considered the proposal carefully. Some could contribute money, though only in small amounts. Others offered stone, timber, labor, or the use of a cart. Those who had earned more from the previous harvest agreed to provide a larger share, while families with less money offered days of work instead. No household was asked for more than it could spare, and each contribution was entered beside its name in the ledger. By the end of the meeting, Hollow Ash had decided to build the room. Work began when the hardest frosts had passed. The ground beside the store was cleared, measured, and marked. Stone was brought from nearby. Timber arrived upon Walter's carts, and men who understood walls and roofing worked beside those able only to carry, lift, or clear away what had been cut. Women prepared meals for the workers, sorted the fittings saved from the summer kitchens, and counted the jars that could be used again. Cordelia watched the walls rise slowly beside the parish store. The room was far smaller than the preserving department at Ashcombe Park, where several fires had once burned beneath a high ceiling, and long tables had extended almost the full length of the north wall. There would be no separate office, no row of polished copper pans belonging to the estate, and no storeroom large enough to hold the produce of many acres. But every foot of the new room had been planned according to work Hollow Ash had already performed. The central tables were broad enough for several people to wash, cut, and weigh fruit without crowding one another. The range could hold the village's largest preserving pan while leaving space for water to remain heating beside it. Near the washing area, shelves were arranged so that clean jars could be kept apart from those waiting to be scrubbed. The storage racks were deep enough for filled jars to stand without being stacked dangerously, and a dry cupboard was reserved for sugar, labels, cloth and covers. Cordelia placed the weighing table where light from the window would fall clearly across the scales and ledger. She made certain that the shelves could be reached without carrying hot jars through the busiest part of the room. The arrangement possessed none of the size or elegance of Ashcombe, yet there was a practical order in it that had not been imposed by a distant owner or designed for machinery still to come. It had been shaped by the hands, kitchens and harvests of hollow ash itself. Before the room was completed, Prue and Walter visited Cordelia at her lodgings on behalf of the village committee. They asked her to become manager of the preserving room and technical advisor to the families whose fruit would pass through it. A regular wage would be paid from the village fund and from the income earned by future sales. The amount was lower than the salary Cordelia had received at Ashcombe Park, and there could be no certainty that every year would produce the same return as the first. The offer, nevertheless, contained something her former position had never provided. At Ashcombe, Cordelia had maintained a system that belonged entirely to the estate. She had been permitted to order its work, but had possessed no voice in its future. When the property was sold, 2 decades of experience had been removed as easily as an old table replaced by a machine. At Hollow Ash, the room had been built because the village understood what her knowledge allowed them to do. Cordelia would decide the working methods, approve the recipes, supervise cleanliness, and keep the standards upon which the market orders depended. Her judgment would not be tolerated merely until a newer process arrived. It had become part of the reason the room existed. She accepted the position. In early spring, before the first soft fruit required attention, another matter was entered in the committee's record. Nell, now 14, was to become the first formal apprentice of the Hollow Ash preserving room. A few villagers questioned whether a girl of 14 should be given a recognized place in work, upon which so many households now depended. Nell had helped throughout the previous season, but an apprenticeship meant more than carrying messages, washing jars, or writing figures at Cordelia's direction. It meant learning every stage until she could be trusted to judge the fruit, organize the workers, and correct a difficulty when Cordelia was elsewhere. Cordelia answered the concern with the evidence already contained in the ledger. Nell had remained at the recording table when others moved between the kitchens. She had found repeated batch numbers, anticipated shortages, and redirected fruit according to ripeness without losing the name of the household that had supplied it. She had shown patience with ordinary work and steadiness when the village was tired. Her age did not erase what she had already proved. Nell's name was entered beneath Cordelia's. Their first spring in the new room began with strawberries. The quantities were smaller than the plum harvest, allowing Cordelia to establish the order of the room without haste. Nell prepared the working sheets, checked the clean jars, and learned to recognize the slight differences between fruit ready for immediate cooking and fruit that could remain until the following morning. Pears and apples followed later in the year. Each fruit required a different method, and Cordelia refused to treat the success of the plum jam as proof that one process could be used for everything. Some batches needed longer preparation, others required gentler heat or different proportions. The details were tested in small quantities before the village accepted them for larger work. Cordelia's recipe book continued to grow. Beside her neat handwriting appeared Nell's narrower script, recording the behavior of a particular variety, the yield from a measured quantity, and the changes required when a season had been unusually wet or warm. The pages no longer seemed to belong entirely to the years at Ashcombe. Hollow ash was entering them line by line. Walter became one of the strongest supporters of the new enterprise. Whenever he travelled beyond the village, he carried samples or spoke to traders who might take the goods. He introduced the hollow ash labels at markets, where the village had never previously sold anything except fresh fruit, and his former caution became useful in a different way. He accepted no vague promise from a buyer and encouraged the room to supply only quantities it could produce without lowering its standard. By the autumn of 1898, the preserving room no longer felt new. Its stone floor bore the faint marks of tables moved for cleaning. The wooden spoons had darkened with use, and the shelves held jars made from strawberries, pears, apples, and the returning plum harvest. The ledger lay open beneath the window, while Cordelia's recipe book rested beside it, the two kinds of handwriting sharing more pages than before. One quiet morning, Cordelia entered while the jars were being prepared for the day's work. Nell stood at the washing table, with two younger children beside her. She showed them how each jar must be examined before it entered the hot water, how a small crack made the glass unsuitable, and why a rim that appeared clean still had to be checked beneath the light. She did not shorten the explanation because they were young, nor did she take the work from their hands when they needed a second attempt. Cordelia remained near the doorway and listened. The room was smaller than Ashcombe's preserving department had been. Its shelves were plain, its pans had come from several households, and the village still had to measure every expense carefully. Yet the knowledge within it no longer depended upon one estate, one employer, or even one pair of hands. At Ashcombe, Cordelia had lost a position in a room that could continue without her. In Hollow Ash, she had helped create a room that would continue because of what she had taught. As Nell guided the children through the work once more, Cordelia understood that she had recovered more than employment. She had found a place where the work belonged to those whose lives depended upon it, and where each season could leave something useful for the season that followed. The preserving room had become part of Hollow Ash, and Cordelia had become part of its keeping. The years that followed were measured less by dates than by the fruit that arrived at the door of the preserving room. Strawberries came first, carrying the mild sweetness of early summer. Cherries followed, then pears and apples, until the plum harvest returned, and the whole room grew warm with steam and the dark, familiar scent that had first brought Cordelia Vane to Hollow Ash. Each season left its own rows upon the shelves, its own figures in the ledger, and another group of villagers who understood the work more thoroughly than they had the year before. The room changed slowly. Wooden spoons became smooth from use. The stone floor faded along the paths between the washing table, the range, and the shelves. New jars replaced those that cracked or chipped, while the largest pans acquired small marks that allowed Cordelia to recognize each one without turning it towards the light. Her recipe book grew thicker. Some pages still carried only the careful handwriting she had brought from Ashcombe Park, but many now held Nell's smaller notes along the margins. A difference in the sweetness of one year's fruit, the longer cooking time required after a wet summer, and the yield from a particular orchard were all recorded. Nothing useful was allowed to disappear merely because one season had ended. After several years, the people of Hollow Ash helped Cordelia build a small house beside the preserving room. It was modest, containing only what she required, but its nearness allowed her to hear the first carts entering the yard on harvest mornings. From one window she could see the door of the room, and from another she could look beyond the parish store towards the orchards. She no longer had to return alone to a rented room in the town after the day's work. Hollow Ash had given her a home beside the place her knowledge had helped to create. The preserving room became a steady part of village life. Not every harvest was abundant, and not every year produced the same profit, but the families were no longer forced to depend entirely upon the price offered for fresh fruit. When the market was poor, the fruit could be kept in another form. When one orchard yielded less, the work of the room still provided wages through fruit gathered elsewhere in the village. Prue Hollis remained Cordelia's closest friend. During the quiet weeks between harvests, the two women often drank tea inside the preserving room. They sat near the window where the weighing table stood, surrounded by empty pans and shelves, waiting for the next season. Their conversations required fewer words as the years passed. Prue might speak of the village, while Cordelia mended a cloth or examined the labels prepared for the coming work. At other times, they simply listened to rain moving against the glass. Nell remained beside Cordelia through all those seasons. In time, she became Nell Ashby, married and living with her own family in Hollow Ash. Yet marriage did not take her away from the preserving room. She continued to arrive before the first fruit was delivered, opened the ledger beneath the window, and prepared the tables as she had learned to do when she was 13. New apprentices came after her. Some were children of families who had worked through the first plum harvest. Others had known the preserving room all their lives and could scarcely imagine Hollow Ash without the warm range, the clean jars, and the labels drying upon the long table. Nell taught them as Cordelia had taught her. She placed the work into their hands and allowed understanding to grow through doing it. They learned to judge fruit by touch, to recognize the change in a boiling preserve, and to examine a jar even when it appeared perfectly clean. When they made a mistake, Nell corrected the work without removing their responsibility for learning from it. During the years of the Great War, the room became busier than it had been before. Jam and preserved goods were prepared for military supplies, while the village continued producing what its own families required. Sugar, jars, and labor had to be measured with greater care, but the system first created during the 10 urgent days of 1897 allowed Hollow Ash to organize the work without confusion. The shelves filled and emptied. Boxes left the village upon carts. The figures in the ledger continued beneath Nell's hand, while Cordelia checked the recipes and watched the batches whenever her sight permitted. By the time Cordelia reached 74, the small writing in the recipe book had become difficult for her to read. Even beneath the clearest light, the figures blurred if she examined them for too long. Her hands still remembered the weight of a spoon and the resistance of preserve ready to set, but she could no longer inspect every jar or distinguish the smallest changes in color with the certainty the work required. She did not wait for a serious mistake to prove what she already understood. One morning, when the tables had been cleaned after the autumn work, Cordelia placed the ledger and the keys before Nell. Nell was 33 then, and had already performed much of the management for several seasons. She knew the growers, the markets, the apprentices, and the capacity of every pan. The transfer required no ceremony because the responsibility had been passing gradually between them for years. From that day, Nell Ashby formally managed the preserving room of Hollow Ash. Cordelia continued to visit. She sat near the window when the room was busy and answered questions when they were brought to her. Sometimes she could identify a problem from the scent rising from a pan before anyone else had noticed it. Yet, she no longer reached automatically for the spoon or the ledger. The work belonged to Nell now, just as Cordelia had always intended that it should. When Cordelia died in 1919, she was 76 years old. Nearly every family in Hollow Ash attended the funeral. The people came from the cottages, farms and orchards through which she had once walked as an unfamiliar woman carrying a recipe book. Many brought jars of preserves made from her methods. They placed them beside her grave. Strawberry, apple, pear, and the dark plum jam with which the work had begun. Nell stood among them with the old recipe book held close against her coat. In her farewell, she recalled the promise Cordelia had made in the parish hall 22 years before. Cordelia had not promised that the plan would succeed. She had promised only that she would remain with the village throughout the 10 days and share responsibility for what followed. Nell said that Cordelia had kept that promise for 22 years. The following year, Walter Griggs died. In his will, he left money to the village fund for the maintenance of the preserving room. It was the final contribution of the man who had once doubted whether Cordelia's methods could belong anywhere beyond a great estate. The room continued under Nell's care. More apprentices learned beside its tables, and new entries appeared beneath the older writing in the recipe book. Seasons passed over the orchards, but the knowledge gathered inside the room passed quietly from one pair of hands to another. The preserving room still grew warm with every harvest. The scent of ripe plums returned with the autumn, and on the highest shelf, 2 women's handwriting remained upon the same old pages. And so the work continued, passing quietly from one pair of hands to another, while the old recipe book remained upon the shelf, and the scent of ripe plums returned with every autumn. Beyond the warm preserving room, evening settled softly over Hollow Ash, the darkened orchards, the quiet village, and the patient turning of the seasons.